Hi, everyone. We're just going to wait until our noon start time, give folks a chance to trickle in, and then we will get started. But it's great to see all of you on so far. Okay, well, it is noon, and in the interest of time, I'm going to get us rolling. It is great to see all of you who are on here. My name is Amanda Wentz, and I am a DPS employee. I am the supervisor of the Therapeutic Service Provider Program. You are attending a webinar hosted by the SHP, School Health Professionals Program in DPS. They offer like tier 1 across the board preventative programming and then group intervention. The TSP program offers students group intervention and individual therapeutic services. So between our two programs, it's a nice continuum of care that we're trying to kind of add on for our students, especially in the wake of COVID. And in that spirit, we have Katie Wildenberg Cross with us today. Wilderbing Cross. So Katie and I have met a couple of times. She just actually presented to the TSP team yesterday on grief and loss. She is an LCSW licensed clinical social worker in the state of Colorado, and she's the assistant director of community-based care at Judi's House and the JAG Institute. She's been with the organization, with Judi's House, for over 9 years, has served in a lot of roles, direct service provision through the Pathfinders program, and supervising graduate and postgraduate interns. In her current role, she is dedicated specifically to supporting community-based programs. So Katie works with school districts, which is why she's with us today, schools, other organizations, to just kind of let all of us know about Judi's House programming and how to access it for our students who are experiencing grief and don't have other kind of inroads to bereavement services. So Katie provides as a living specialized trainings in grief education to youth professionals and parents. As I said just yesterday, I accessed one of those trainings and had a great time. So we're so lucky to have you here, Katie, and I am going to go ahead and hand it off to you if you're all ready to go.
Ready to go. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, everyone, for joining this lunch hour for the webinar. I'm going to be talking today about supporting grieving families. So I'm going to provide some different types of information. So hopefully be able to provide some basics about grief and grief reactions and what we know about kids who have experienced this type of death loss. And also hopefully you'll walk away with some strategies for being able to support the folks that you know who have experienced a death loss. And so in acknowledging the heaviness of this topic, grief and death can be topics that bring up a lot of different experiences for ourselves, depending on where we are in our own grief journeys and life spaces. So just want to acknowledge that it's important to pay attention how you're responding to this topic today. So if you need to take a break, please do so. I can't see anyone anyway, so if you need to walk away, get a drink of water, just take some deep breaths, please, 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 I encourage you to do so. Also, just acknowledge the importance of respect in this conversation, that grief is unique. And so we know that all different parts of who we are come up as it relates to this experience. And so whether we identify related to a certain race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, gender, all of those pieces will be honored in my presentation today. And then finally, I encourage you to reach out for support if you need it. And so I have some specific pieces there regarding the Colorado Crisis Services information hotline, as well as their text, and then the Safe to Tell number if you're concerned about a student in general, that is available there. And I have a slide at the end that has a bit more information about some other additional resources for you to access, and we'll pass those slides along to folks who are in this webinar today too. So just a brief background about Judi's House. Judi's House was founded in 2002 by Brian Greasy and Dr. Brooke Greasy in honor of his mom, Judi, who died when he was 12 years old from breast cancer. And so as a child, Brian openly shares about that experience related to his mom's death and how difficult that was for him and how alone he felt, that he felt like there weren't any other kids his age who could relate to that experience. And so as an adult, him and, like I said, his wife, Dr. Brooke Greasy, who's a clinical psychologist, co-founded Judi's House to provide support to kids and families who had experienced a death loss. And so all of our services at Judi's House are completely free of charge. We offer groups, individual, family, couples counseling, as again, completely free of charge in English and Spanish. We also have young adult services, so for kids ages 3 to 25 and their adult caregivers. We also provide services in groups to schools. So that's the program that, as Amanda mentioned, that I oversee, where we go into middle schools and actually provide grief groups in schools. And we also provide different types of trainings, including grief trainings for kids, because we know that this is a topic that everyone is impacted by, and yet we don't talk about it very much. So wanting to provide opportunities for kids to know that they're not alone, because that's the purpose of the organization, the vision, that no child feels alone in their grief. And so really working towards that vision as an organization. So want to start off with some basics. So what is grief? I think especially in this time of COVID and the pandemic, grief is a term that has been thrown around and talked about a lot, but what does it mean? So we say that grief is all of the thoughts, feelings, and reactions we have after we lose someone or something. And I know sometimes when we think about grief, oftentimes people think about sadness or depression or sorrow, and that's one type of grief reaction, or one type. And we know that it's so much bigger and broader and so much more encompassing than just sadness. And so that's where that definition is, all of these different reactions after we lose someone or something. And so that's grief, more generally speaking. And so bereavement is another term that we talk about. And bereavement is the specific experience of a death loss. So in experiencing the death of an important person. So that experience of grief, it's a specific type of grief. So that bereavement related to death. And then the third term that gets incorporated into this conversation is mourning. And so mourning is how we display that grief to others and to the world. And so again, acknowledging that it looks very different for different people. And it also is really interconnected with our own backgrounds, our own identities. So maybe certain parts of maybe religious beliefs and how we honor someone after they die, whether it be a wake or holding Shiva, or different things that maybe we do to honor that person, a certain color clothing, certain behaviors. Some cultures and some folks are very expressive in their grief. And so maybe there's a lot of crying and wailing and even fainting. And that's part of how certain cultures or communities express that grief. Others may be more private. I know in some belief systems that, saying the name of the person who died can disrupt their afterlife process in some way. And so knowing that there's no right or wrong, this mourning just looks different in terms of how we display our grief related to our own backgrounds and identities. So some of our philosophies, and I've mentioned some of these already, but some of our beliefs that are really core to how we approach supporting bereaved families is acknowledging that grief is both universal and unique. And so knowing that everyone will experience the death of someone important to them at some point in their lives. And so it's a universal experience. And so even in working with kids who feel like Brian Greasy did, that I'm the only one who's experienced this, we know that that's not true because it is a universal life experience. And at the same time, each individual's experience of grief is unique. There's no right or wrong. There's no one size fits all. There's not stages to grief, as I know some folks have heard about the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief that actually are more connected to an adult who has found out that they are going to die, that those don't apply to kids and families who have experienced the death of an important person. We know that grief is a normal, natural, healthy reaction to loss. When we feel connected to someone and that relationship changes because that person is no longer physically present, there's going to be responses. And those are natural, normal, healthy responses, even though they may be difficult and painful. We believe that grief has no timeline. I know sometimes we have the question, when will it be over? When will I move forward? When can I get back to normal? And grief doesn't have a timeline. There's no set amount of time that it takes to be done. It's an ongoing, lifelong journey. We also believe that each individual has the natural capacity to heal with appropriate support. And so sometimes that support may include mental health providers. That may include getting connected with Judi's house to participate in a group. Maybe that means learning some new coping strategies to manage the intense anger that a kid may experience in their grief, but that we have the natural capacity to heal in that grief. Next, I want to speak somewhat briefly about acknowledging that grief and the understanding of death changes as kids get older. So there's a handout on our website that I will connect you to in my follow-up email that will have the slides and some links to resources as well, and information that I am touching on in this presentation. So lots of really great information on our website. Everything, as I mentioned, that Judi's House does is free. So our resources on our website are free as well. And so being able to access that, even though I know I'm going somewhat briefly through I will go somewhat briefly through this particular slide, but just want to acknowledge that grief looks different across different aged kids. And so I know even for the first little age group there, birth to 2, sometimes, we have that, or people will say, oh, they're a baby, they don't remember, it doesn't impact them, they don't get it, they're not going to grieve. We actually believe and know that even infants can experience those grief reactions. It may just look different. Their brains aren't developed enough to really understand the complexities of what death and grief mean, but they know that that person's not there anymore. And so there may be some changes in sleeping, eating, behavioral changes, more fussiness, things like that. And that's a grief response for that age group. And so I acknowledge also that these age groups are chronological. So acknowledging that maturity differences, different types of potential disabilities can impact, how kids are responding given those age groups. So these are just kind of general informational guides to how grief looks different in different age group kids. So those 3 to 5, we know that their brains are developing, and so they struggle to understand death and its permanence. So oftentimes with this age group, information may need to be repeated over and over because we know that they may think, oh, death isn't permanent, that, daddy died, but he's going to come back next week. And so being able to have these really concrete conversations with this age group, we encourage folks to use words like dead, died, and death, because saying someone went to sleep and is never going to wake up, or they're lost. Well, if they're sleeping, wake them up. If they're lost, go find them, right? And so those terms can cause confusion for younger kiddos. And so wanting to use that concrete, direct language so that they can start to understand what's happening in their lives. In the 6 to 9 age group, they have a more complete understanding of death at this time, but they're still concrete. So they may still have some questions or really trying to understand what's happening. And so they're really maybe talking about the death, and sometimes even talking to people outside the family. Or I know sometimes we hear stories where they were talking to the grocery store worker about their parent who died, because that's a big part of their life and their reality. And so sometimes kids want to talk about it, right? We know that transitions can be even more difficult. So whether that be going back to school after an extended break, that it feels like we're starting all over at the beginning of the school year. Why are they having such a hard time with the morning routine? Those transitions can be even more difficult for grieving kids. We know that some of the different types of grief reactions that I'm going to speak about in a moment can bring up difficulties at school or with friends. And so we know that being able to have conversations about the grief and what's going on can be really helpful. The 10 to 12 age group, those middle school years, we know that at that point in development, friends and peers are even more important than they've ever been before. And so they care a lot sometimes about what their friends or what other people think. And so we know sometimes in middle school, we hear sometimes from schools or from caregivers that, I don't think they're grieving because nothing has changed. We often encourage folks to be curious about, what's going on internally versus what they're showing to others, because maybe they want to blend in. A lot of middle schoolers will say, I just want to be normal. I don't want to stand out. I don't want to be the kid whose person died. I just want to be like everybody else. And so maybe they aren't expressing their grief, but that doesn't mean it's not there. Right. We also know in middle school, some of these grief reactions can become more intense around anxiety, depression, including self-harm, suicidal ideation. These are things that we know come up in middle school and can absolutely happen even before that, but really wanting to pay attention to some of those safety pieces in the grief and outside grief as well, but really to make sure kids are getting the support that they need, especially as it relates to safety concerns. And then in the 13 plus age group, those high school years, at this point in their development, they're really able to more abstractly try to wrap their mind around what's happening. And so they have a complete adult understanding of death. And so they know that that person isn't coming back and all the different pieces of what that means. And so they also are at the point where they may be exploring how it relates to their identity, how it relates to their beliefs and some of their existential thinking. So why are we alive? And what is the meaning of life? And some of these really big picture sorts of questions and explorations. We also know in high school, kids have access to things that can be harmful to them, such as drugs, alcohol, weapons, cars, things like that. So again, really wanting to pay attention to how they're coping and how they're engaging in the world, in life, to make sure that they're safe. And then finally, young adults. We know that young adulthood is a time of great transition already, as young adults are moving potentially out of their family or the household that they grew up in and are moving on to whether it be other school or job. And so it can already be a big transition time. So adding the layer of grief and the different reactions that may be coming up can make this an added layer of difficulty for young adults. So wanting to make sure that we're checking in and providing supports and care for young adults as well. So as I mentioned, going to talk just briefly about grief reactions. And so these, again, keeping in mind that developmentally as kids get older, these may look different, but we start off with talking about 4 different types of grief reactions. And the first being emotional reactions or feelings. And so some of the feelings, as I mentioned earlier on, that oftentimes people connect sadness with grief. And as I said as well, we know that that is not the only feeling in grief, that there can be so many others. So just some others that come up often in grief include anger, anxiety, fears and worries, insecurities, guilt, confusion. We also know that sometimes there can be relief. Maybe someone was really sick for a long time and maybe they were in pain. And so when they die, there can be relief that they're not experiencing that pain or that difficulty anymore. Or maybe someone was struggling with addiction. Maybe the relationship was abusive or distant or difficult in some way. And some people may experience relief that they don't have to experience that anymore. And I know that oftentimes we focus grief on some of these more painful, difficult emotions, but we know others can exist as well. And those are just as valid and natural as more painful ones. Love can also exist. Hope can be a piece of grief as well. The next category of grief reactions that we talk about are the cognitive reactions. And so these are the thoughts or pictures that go through our minds. And so as we think about grief and related to the death of an important person, we know that the thoughts related to the person that died or what happened can make it difficult to focus on things that we need to focus on. Like for kids with school, it can be hard to focus on math when you're thinking about what's going to happen to my family or what happened to my person that died. It can make it really difficult. And so we know that oftentimes this can look like ADHD. And so really being curious about what's going on for kids before jumping to conclusions around diagnoses or medication and things like that. Next are the behavioral reactions. So when we think about behaviors, I know sometimes people think about meltdowns, temper tantrums, withdrawal, some of these difficult sorts of behaviors, getting into fights. As I mentioned, some of those unhealthy coping strategies like alcohol and drugs and risk-taking behaviors. We also know that sometimes for kids who have had a person die, sometimes maybe they go the other direction in terms of overachieving. My family is already experiencing a lot of difficulties, so I'm going to really do well and not make things harder. So I'm going to get good grades. I'm going to make good choices. I'm not going to ruffle any feathers. And that can be a grief response too, right? And then finally, we talk about physical reactions. So these are oftentimes I think about as body reactions. So how does my body feel when I'm in my grief? Is my heart beating faster? Do I have butterflies in my stomach? Do I hold a lot of tension in my shoulders and in my jaw, right? And so what are these body reactions? And again, these are going to look different for different age groups. And so sometimes these may be a lot of tummy aches with little ones or headaches with older kids. I meant to mention this even with the younger kids, but we also see regression is really common in grief, and that looks different for different age groups, but especially with younger ones, we may see more toilet training accidents, more clinginess that maybe hadn't been the case for a few years, but that regression is really normal. Even for older kids to all of a sudden be more clingy, those are all very typical reactions too. And so we talk about these 4 reactions as being separate, or these categories, but also connected. And so this is the little image that we use at Judy's house to be able to share with kids that, yes, these are 4 different types of reactions and they're all connected. And so when I'm thinking, I miss my person, I'm feeling angry, I have a stomach ache, I have those butterflies in my stomach. So what do? I hit my little brother. Right? And so how all of those are connected and how we really want to support kids in paying attention to that little stoplight that they have inside of them so that they can learn how to manage that anger, to maybe take a deep breath before I punch my little brother. And then maybe those butterflies in my stomach ease a little bit. I have the thought, I miss my dad, but hitting my brother isn't going to help. And so I'm going to go find something healthy to do. Maybe instead of choosing to hit my brother, I go ask my mom for a hug. Right? And so being able to teach kids how to pay attention to what's going on in order to figure out ways to cope in healthy ways. So as I've mentioned already, grief is complex. I encourage you to be curious about what's going on for the folks in your lives who have experienced a death loss. Because even though we want grief to be this nice line of beginning, middle, and end, right? That someone died, there's going to be some emotions, some experiences, some thoughts, some different sorts of behaviors, and then it's over. But as I mentioned, it actually works in a way that's much more complicated and messy. And there's an arrow. It's not an endpoint, right? That it's an ongoing, lifelong experience that we continue to figure out, how do I manage? Acknowledging that grief waves can come up, especially we know this time of year can be really intense for grieving families because the holidays sometimes bring up some of these more intense thoughts and feelings related to the death of our important person. And so just being able to have conversations as families and being able to figure out ways to cope and honor the person that died is such an important part of this conversation as well. So next, gonna shift, and I believe we have some polls for this next piece of my presentation or this webinar. And so I know oftentimes when I talk to folks that they want some specific words to say, what do I do? So I've got all this information about what grief is and different grief reactions. I know kind of what to look for in the people that I care about. but what do I say? What do I do? I don't want to mess this up. I care about this person so much. I want to do the right thing, but I don't know what the right thing is. So that's what this next part is. So not to say that there is a, black and white works for everybody, one size fits all, but these are some guidelines. These are some ideas, some things to think about in terms of how to support the people in your life. And so I have some statements that we're going to put up in a poll, in a few polls actually. And so I would encourage you to click whether you think it's a helpful thing to say or a hurtful thing to say to a bereaved family or someone that you care about. Also, again, want to reiterate that there are no absolutes. All of this is nuanced and very personal to our experiences and the person that you're supporting. So, again, be curious. If you're not sure, ask, right? That it's okay to sometimes say the wrong thing and to go back around and say, hey, it seemed like maybe that didn't feel good to you. How can we talk about it, right? So being able to lean into some of that discomfort of wanting to avoid grief, which is generally what as a society we do. We avoid, we tiptoe, we just don't say anything. And we encourage folks to lean into that and to say something, to let folks know that you care. And so here's some ideas for how to do that. So the first one is, I heard about your loss. I'm here if you want to talk or just want some company. Ooh, I see them coming in. Thank you, those that are participating. I appreciate it. It looks like it is at 100% helpful right now, which is great. I don't know how the polls work. I know Leah's helping me out. So I think that's good. I think, should I end it or you got it? Perfect. So yep, everybody said that that's helpful. And so it's okay to bring it up, right? That essentially this one is to the point of, I heard about your loss. I'm here if you want to talk or just want some company. And it also gives folks the option to say, you know what, not right now, but you know that they're there, right? Or they know that you're there, that you can handle talking about it when they're ready. Awesome. So helpful. Agree. Next one. I know how you must feel. Awesome. Thank you for folks who are participating. Appreciate it. And I think this one can feel really genuine, right? That like, I know how you must feel. I've had someone die too, even when I know sometimes caring adults are supporting kids, that I know how you must feel. I had someone die when I was your age too. But really, when we say that, it takes away from that person's experience. Instead, we would encourage you to be curious, to ask, what is that experience like for you? Even though I know that it can feel, it feels genuine and compassionate, but it doesn't quite impact the grieving individual in that way most of the time. All right, next one. They said he died suddenly, but didn't say how. I wonder if he committed suicide. Hurtful or helpful? That one came in fast. Thank you, everybody. Yeah, absolutely. Hurtful. There's a few layers to this one that are particularly hurtful. So first of all, gossiping about death and grief and causes of death, off limits. I know that as humans, we are curious and we try to fill in information when we don't have it, but I would really encourage you to not gossip, not make assumptions. And then just want to add to, so at Judy's house, and I know DPS aligns with this as well, and most folks do, but this idea that instead of saying committed suicide, that we would encourage you to shift that to died by suicide. Because when we think of the word committed, we often connect that with a crime or something negative or something where there's blame. And so we know that for people who die by suicide, they were experiencing a lot of different pieces in their lives, whether it be trauma, mental illness, addiction, and that we have compassion for people who die by suicide. And that we know that there are resources and there is support for people who are having thoughts of suicide to reach out to someone who's able to get you connected or someone else connected to the help that they need. All right, next one. Would you like me to go pick up your groceries, watch the kids for an hour, or mow your lawn? Awesome. Yep. I mean, this one feels kind of obvious, right? So it's helpful. And so I know we've heard from grieving families that, and oftentimes we say, let me know if there's something I can do. Then that puts the responsibility on the grieving family to say, okay, let me think about that. I don't even know what I need, right? That's often what we hear from families is, I don't even know what I need. I don't even know what to do. I'm so overwhelmed. I'm so lost. All of these things. And so to give specific things that maybe you could help with. I know we've heard, kind of stories or experiences of people saying, hey, I'm going to come pick up your laundry, leave it outside your door. I don't even, if you don't want to talk, that's totally fine. Just leave it out. I'll get your laundry done, folded, and return it tomorrow. Right. So being able to offer concrete things to support is a really good idea. And then if they say no, that's okay too. Letting them have that out. If they're like, you know what, we just need to spend some time as a family right now. No, thank you. That's okay too. Letting them have that control and to honor that too. All right, next one. I know how hard things are for you right now, but you need to be strong. Your kids need you. Yep, awesome. So, yep, hurtful, right? And it's that validation of, I know how hard things are for you right now, but you need to be strong. But what does strong mean, right? Strong typically means you need to put your feelings aside. You need to put on a face that you're okay, even though you're not, because your kids need you. We encourage folks to, it's okay to be vulnerable and honest. Kids, as I mentioned with that definition of mourning, adults and kids are all figuring out, how do I express this? And so kids are looking to those adults. And so to be able to model, it's okay to cry, it's okay to talk about it. You don't need to push those feelings and experiences down. And I think this is the last one. And it is, I know it's been a year since your child passed away. I just wanted to check in. Yeah. Great. I see all helpfuls coming in, and I agree. And so that piece of paying attention to dates, even if you don't know exact dates, having kind of a general idea of, hey, I think it's been about a year, or hey, I think this maybe would have been their birthday. And so to be able to reach out and say, hey, I just wanted to check in. I'm not making assumptions about what this means to you or how you're thinking or feeling or reacting to it, but I'm here for you. I'm thinking about you. I just wanted to open up that conversation, right? Because we know, as I mentioned earlier, that oftentimes we tend to avoid or not pay attention or wanting to not talk about grief. And really the opposite is really what's most supportive, is being able to check in, to bring it up, to be there for the folks that we care about. And I know that everyone in this webinar wants to do that because you're here. Great. Thank you, everybody, for participating in that little activity. And I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. So just have a few final pieces before I wrap up this segment of the webinar. And so I know that talking about or listening to a webinar about grief and death can feel heavy. It can be hard. And so it's really important to make sure that we're paying attention to our own needs and making sure we're finding balance, whether we are grieving or we know folks who are, or whether we are just trying to get through the day-to-day stresses of life and family and work and all of the and holidays potentially. And so being able to find balance of taking space to breathe, to take care of ourselves through staying connected to family and friends, practicing self-compassion, especially when times are hard, right? We are all doing the best with what we have during this time. And it's, as I mentioned, modeling what grief looks like, that deep breathing and relaxation techniques. So making sure that we're bringing oxygen to our bodies, not just shallow breaths that can sometimes even, cause us to feel panicked, but those deep breaths, taking care of our bodies through exercise, water, and healthy food. And again, reaching out for help when you need it. I do have a brief survey. We have some wonderful support at Judy's house in being able to offer these workshops for free, or these webinars. Let me go back and escape here. Let me put this. Can I post in the chat? Can I do that? I will put this in here. And if everyone who is present in this webinar today, it's probably a 2-minute survey that if you could click on that link, and it should take you to a really brief survey just to help us continue to learn what's helpful, how this has been for you today. It's invaluable. Your insights and your feedback is truly how we're able to continue doing this work for free. And so if you could just click on it real quick right now. Like I said, it's a very brief survey and is incredibly helpful to us at Judy's House to be able to do this work. So I will give it just a very brief amount of time. And then I have one more slide to share, and then we will open it up for Q&A.
Okay, looking at the Q&As that were helpfully posted in the section on Zoom. Thanks, y'all. One of the questions is, can you talk about traumatic grief for our children that may have really negative experiences or memories of their loved one?
Yeah. So that's a very specific question. So I think that as it relates to trauma and grief and traumatic grief, there are some different diagnoses and opinions in the bereavement field regarding traumatic grief as potentially a diagnosis or the impact of that on youth. And so really being curious, and if there are concerns about traumatic grief for kids, that I would encourage getting that individual or family connected to resources, mental health support specifically, because we know that trauma can really have a significant impact on a child's ability to move through the world in different ways. And so my thought around that is get connected to some mental health support, because that can be an intense experience for a kid. Was there another part of that question, Amanda?
Yes, just how we process that with a child who has really negative or difficult experiences and memories.
So I would say kind of another piece around that I would encourage is being curious. So at Judy's House, kind of maybe connected to that, is not making assumptions about what a child's experience is. I think that at Judy's House, you'll notice that I say the significant or the special person that died or the important person that died. I never say the loved one. And that's very much on purpose, because we know that the relationship maybe wasn't loving, it maybe wasn't supportive, and maybe they're happy that the person died because of maybe a traumatic relationship, or maybe there was some abuse, or maybe there are some different elements that complicated that relationship. And so creating space, I would say, in supporting that child, it sounds like maybe in a more therapeutic or mental health focused way, to create space for kids to process and to be honest about what those experiences were. I also am always cautious in supporting kids in processing trauma in certain spaces, because we don't want to open up too much in a way that's not going to be able to be supported and contained and really addressed in that moment. So I would say creating space for kids to process what they need, but also being cautious about opening up too much.
Thank you, Katie. The next question is, my child could really benefit from some support in hearing all of this, but does not want to do an in-person group. Does Judy's House offer virtual groups?
Great question. We don't offer virtual groups, but we do have virtual counseling services. And so we have individual, couples, and family services that are all available virtually as well. And so as a grief organization, we have been very intentional and cautious as it relates to the pandemic. And so masks and distancing and filters and all of those things are a very important part of our work at this point. And so for kids who are cautious, or maybe even hesitant or unsure, that we do have our process to get involved with services starts with a phone call, or there's an outreach section on our website. And so it starts with that. There's an application, and then we invite the family to come in for a one-on-one interview with a member of our team. So that's an opportunity too for your kid to potentially ask the counselor some questions, get an idea of what we do, how we do it, how they might be able to engage in a way that feels safe for them. Great question.
Thank you. Someone shared this loss analogy with me, the question asker. After you lose someone in your family, the survivors are standing at the top of a mountain and trying to help each other down, but all of their bones are broken. Can you talk about how to get more support for everyone involved?
Yeah, so I mean, Judy's house, we have a strong family system approach to the work that we do, which is why, especially, when a whole family has experienced a death loss, I think that that analogy really can fit, that everyone feels or can feel. And like I said, being curious that that might not necessarily be the case. I know I worked with a family once where the person who died was very abusive to one member of the family. And so that person was quite joyful that that person had died, but there were other members of the family who had very different experiences. So wanting to be, again, curious about that. Um, but being able to really support the whole family. And I know that came up in our conversation yesterday with Amanda's team, but just that piece of really emphasizing the importance of wanting to get each member of the family. And so at Judy's house, we support kids and their caregivers because it's such a big element of a child's ability to heal and process their grief is connected to caregivers being able to support them through that as well. So we have caregiver groups at Judy's house and supports and individual counseling too, because it's such an important part of that grief journey is being able to support the whole family in that. Next question.
My child seems irritated and shuts down when I bring up the person who has died. Should I continue to talk about it?
Yes. And I know that I'm hypothesizing that that person is potentially maybe a middle or high school student, but sometimes, older elementary can have that response too. I hear that a lot. And I think sometimes there's different reasons for that, but sometimes kids are trying to, as I mentioned with that middle school response, right? Like wanting to not open it up because it's uncomfortable or don't want people to know, but to continue modeling and opening up opportunities. Maybe it's sharing memories. Maybe it's just saying, I miss them. Maybe it's expressing your own grief and not forcing kids to talk when they're not ready to. So there's kind of that balance of modeling that it's okay to bring it up. We can talk about this in our family. I am here for you when you're ready, but not wanting to push them into a corner and say, you have to tell me how you're feeling. Giving lots of opportunities, but also kind of stepping back if they're not quite in that space and not quite ready. But it's okay to keep bringing it up. I would encourage you to keep bringing it up, but letting your kid take the lead too. Which I know is kind of complicated. It's a dance for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What recommendations do you have for mental health support staff in schools who are working with adults or staff who insist that the student engage in grief groups or therapy, but the student doesn't want to at that time or they're refusing?
Similar to what I just said, right? That even I have kids in my, I do groups in schools and counseling and things. And we have a rule at Judy's house that we call it our I pass rule. So kids don't have to talk if they don't want to. And even in groups, I always have kids who are like, Miss, do I have to do that? And I'm like, no, you never have to do anything. I'm providing opportunities for you to explore your grief. But if it doesn't feel safe or comfortable for you, don't do it, right? Like you need to pay attention to your own needs and your own reactions, that if this doesn't feel safe and you're not ready, that's okay. Forcing something is only going to make things more difficult in the long run. But also providing that information that, at Judy's house, we say that grief is like a wound. And so if you try to ignore it, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to go away on its own. It's going to heal in a healthy way. It could get infected. It could cause more problems down the road. But even though it can be difficult and painful to clean out that wound, to maybe get those stitches, it helps it to heal in a healthy way. And so providing some of that education about why it's important, but also not pressuring kids when they're not ready.
Great. Someone else would like to know, what if a parent is not getting help for their children after the loss of the other parent?
Similar, along that same line, right? Of if they're not ready, we have to trust that families, we provide lots of tools and strategies and opportunities and resources and try to do what we can. And at the end of the day, we have to trust that families know what's best for them and that maybe they're not ready, or maybe there's other complicating factors that are impacting them. Maybe there's pieces that maybe they can't get to Judy's house. Maybe they don't have, the resources, that there could be lots of reasons or complicating pieces, or maybe mental health resources don't feel safe for different cultural reasons, right? That there can be lots of reasons that folks are hesitant or resistant. But I would say continuing to provide those lines of support, and hope that folks will reach out when they're ready or when it feels right for them.
Okay, thank you. How do you balance helping a child that is hesitant or resistant to talk about their grief or loss, but wanting to make sure they know you are open to talk about it when they are ready, which I think we've spoken to pretty considerably here.
Concern, right? It is a big concern.
Yeah,
it's not like
absolutely.
they're pushing it down, they're avoiding it. I don't want it to become that unaddressed wound that's going to impact, because we know that unaddressed grief and unresolved trauma can cause lifelong difficulties, right? Whether it be relationships or substance abuse or things like that. So it is a very valid question and concern. And I love that folks are asking these questions. And so I think continuing those conversations and opening up the dialogue and saying, hey, I'm here when you're ready. And I would say in my experience, continuing to not just say that, but to actually be open and be supportive. It's not just the words, right? It's also the spaces that we create for kids. And
Yeah,
adults.
I'm hearing presence, your presence and openness, and then you
Yes.
can make some room in there. Great.
Yeah, I love that.
Okay, and the last one that we've got on here, because there's a duplicate, is I provide therapy to a 16-year-old who lost her father in January of 2021. She's the oldest child and often feels pressured from family, aunt and uncle, to be strong for her mom and siblings. I've worked with her to validate her feelings and ensure she knows it's okay to express her feelings. Any other suggestions, since I can't control what her family says to her?
That's yep, not an unusual situation, but I think it sounds like you're doing all the things that I would recommend, just in continuing to provide space, in considering some of those family pieces, is there, this might be overstepping. So I don't know the family. I don't know you. I don't know a lot. But is there a potential opportunity for kiddo or for student to say, hey, to advocate for herself, or maybe for some other kind of system oriented pieces that could be incorporated, or working with mom and, encouraging mom to, find that balance of, hey, how can we bring folks together? Because sometimes, I know even in my work with teenagers, sometimes having a conversation with them together to say, or encouraging mom to come to we have free parent guardian. This is like a super abbreviated version. We have a much longer, more detailed workshop online that's free for parents and guardians to get information about some of those pieces, essentially those boundaries for parents and guardians to be able to support the kids, right? That yes, I'm sad. Yes, I am grieving, but I can still handle your grief. Right? That I can still be here for you. And when I need help, I reach out to your Aunt Susie. I reach out to someone through our church. I reach out to my own counselor so that I can be here for you. And so some of those psychoeducation pieces can be helpful. I feel like I'm just kind of rambling and throwing out a lot of ideas, but it sounds like you're doing the things that I would recommend in providing that education and support and space for that teen to express herself to.
And then another question just popped up. Does Judy's house offer, this is a little more concrete. Does Judy's house offer grief counseling to adults who are grieving after a loss but do not have children in their home? And if not, do you have a referral to another organization that does offer that support?
Great question. I just sent that to somebody yesterday. So I have that. If you would like to reach out here, I can put my email in the chat. Reach out to me and I would be happy to email that to you, because so to answer the question, no, we don't do that at Judy's house. Our mission is really focused around childhood bereavement, and we know that there are many adults who are bereaved who need support as well. And so I have access to a list for those resources. So feel free to email me. Anyone is welcome to email me with other questions These have been amazing questions. What a wonderful group of folks. So I want to share just a real quick quote with you that grief is not about letting go. It's not about moving on, getting over it, putting it behind you. It's about holding on in a different way. How do I continue connecting with my person who died in this new way, through memories, through honoring them in different ways? And then here's that slide that I mentioned. Reach out for support, reach out to your kid's school, reach out to the mental health providers, some crisis lines on your screen. Please, please, please reach out if you know that their safety concerns or just want to get some extra help and support.
Okay, well, so looking through the chat, as was mentioned, Katie's email is in there, and the recording of this webinar will be shared on the DPS prevention website in the webinar section and emailed to participants. And so we really appreciate all of you taking the time to sit with us through this hard but really important topic, right? Death is a natural part of life, and learning to cope and move through it and support one another is essential. So Katie, thank you so much for being here. If there's any other questions, feel free to reach out to the prevention services team. Again, Katie's email is in the chat. And have a wonderful rest of your day, all.
Thank you so much.
Katie, thank you. Amanda, thank you. I
Thank you.
learned so much. Thank you so much.
Good, good. My pleasure.